Kenneth Rosen, you are the senior editor and correspondent at Newsweek based in Italy, and you are the author of two books. Your first one was called Bulletproof Vest, and the second one, the one that we're going to speaking about today, is Trouble, the failed promise of American behavioral treatment programs. Kenneth, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, Kenneth, I have been reading your book. It's gripping. The thing that I find interesting is that these are the kind of things that most people don't know about. I mean, we always wonder, what do people do with troubled teenagers, and how do parents go around it? How do they survive? Because it's a difficult time in everyone's life. And your story, of course, is one of those glimpses of a teenager's life and the parent's life. And you know, at first hand, I dismissed the book because, you know, this is things that happen to other people. But as I read the first few paragraphs, I was just gripped and I couldn't stop reading it. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the story. First of all, who are you, and how is it that you became such a troubled teenager?
Sure, I appreciate the kind words. Troubled is a story of four children who went through tough love behavioral modification programs, and follows them into their adult lives and what became of them afterward. And it's based on more than 100 interviews with former clients of these programs, with psychologists and psychotherapists and counselors who were at the programs, who are familiar with the programs. And what I learned through the reporting of the book was that there were a lot of children who had gone into this type of non-evidence-based treatment and come out worse off than they had gone into it. Now, the one crux of the book is that I was also one of those teenagers. Back when I was 16, I spent 288 days between a wilderness therapy program in upstate New York, a therapeutic boarding school in Massachusetts, and then finally a ranch residential treatment center type lockdown facility in Utah. And I wanted to learn more about my own experience at these programs and try to discover whether or not I too was afflicted into my adulthood.
Okay, and what was the series of events or behavior that drove you parents towards sending you to this kind of camp?
I was on a behavioral, I guess you would call it a sort of, oh man, I'm losing the word, but just a stint of, bad behavior as far as teenagers go. A rebellious streak is what I was looking for, where I would steal my mother's car or take it out for joyrides, or I was smoking pot or drinking with friends. But most of all, I was just not going to school. I was big at avoiding classes and classwork. I was enrolled in high school, but I had more than 200 absences. I rarely went. And my parents at the time were divorcing, so I was living with my mother and sister. And for a single mother, it was really difficult to deal with, an uproarious 15-year-old who wouldn't listen to anything, who was rarely home, who was spending time with older people and going places that my mother wasn't aware of. And it was strenuous on my family. And I don't blame my mother and my father for deciding to take such a drastic route, because they were told by these programs, by an education consultant who was referred to them by the high school, that this was the way to get me to return to normal, that these programs would be the silver bullet in making me a better person. And they took that chance, and it remains to be seen whether or not that was beneficial. A lot of people who went to these programs refer to themselves now as survivors, having gone to the programs and made it out alive. But I don't like using the term survivor, merely because I feel like I'm still struggling a lot with what happened at the programs, whether it be physical or mental or emotional abuse that we suffered while inside.
Right. And do you think this is a stage on life that most teenagers go through, and then eventually they come out of it and there's not need for treatment? I mean, we can see, I go out on the streets and I see teenagers getting drunk, getting high, whatever, playing around. And after a few years, I think they all become regular, law-abiding individuals. But I don't know how much truth there is to that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think there's plenty of debate on whether or not children will just be children, right, and then grow out of it. And a lot of the writing that I've done around the programs and my own experience in the programs has focused on the underlying causes of my anxiety and depression, which I admittedly have or had back then as well. And I found that some of the problems existed in my inability to connect with just this high school mentality. I just didn't want to go to school. I didn't want to sit in a classroom all day and be fed information. It just wasn't how I was learning. And I wasn't also given the tools to understand that I had anxiety. I just felt like I was constantly worried. And the only thing I knew that helped that was smoking cigarettes and drinking and doing the occasional recreational drug. So there were some underlying issues that were never addressed. My parents weren't aware that it could have been better for me to have gone to an alternative high school, or had taken a GED earlier, or had some other form of education that might have been more interesting to me rather than follow this path that was already laid out before me.
Right. And do you ever speculate how would your life have been different if your parents would have just allowed you to be and, just live out that stage of your life?
Well, I've thought about it a lot, and I can't really say for certain how it would have ended up, but I know that they were trying to prevent the worst from happening. And there's plenty of instances where people take it too far, and a lot of us who went to these programs were taking it too far. Whether or not we deserve to be sent away and taken in the middle of the night is one thing, but I don't really know that if I had not been stopped, if I wouldn't have gone too far and hurt someone, or continue to hurt myself in a really bad way. I know that if I had somehow been able to look a little bit farther and into my future, and known that there were other options for me, or that life wasn't going to end at 18, and that I had that sort of longevity to my thought process, maybe I could have buckled down and just bit the bullet and done what everyone else was doing. But at the time, it felt more immediate to me to need to follow my own desires, and they might have been wrong then.
Okay. And when a parent takes this kind of decision, the decision that your parents took, they feel like they have no other options. They feel like they have run out of alternative. Uh, if you were a parent, what other alternative do you think are available for parents to use when their kids are troublemakers?
So I've been offering advice that contains mostly community-based approaches to cognitive behavioral therapy, or anything that is local within the community that the child is currently staying, so they can maintain friendships, maintain relationships with the people that they know and are familiar with. But most importantly, it requires a sort of keen sense of observation and understanding of the family in it. And I would encourage all parents and families to really take a long, hard look at the home environment, and anything that might contribute to any wayward behavior, or anything that has contributed to fissures in a child's life or mentality. Sometimes things happen to children that they're just not willing to talk about. And if they're not willing to talk about it with their parents, then it's going to be something that eats them up and takes them down.
Right. Okay. You open your book with a description of how you were, quote unquote, taken, or in other words, you were kidnapped from your bedroom. Can you describe that experience and how you felt at that moment?
Those programs that we're referring to are often serviced by what are known as escorts, or transportation specialists, who parents hire to take children from their beds in the middle of the night and bring them to their first program. And for me, that happened one night at 2:30 in the morning, where two men walked into my room and woke me up and asked me if I wanted to do this the easy way or the hard way, and then restrained me in my bed and made me put on a pair of clothes to then take me 9 hours north to the Adirondack Mountains in New York, and introduce me to my first program. So it's a sort of rupturous way of introducing someone, especially a teenager, to therapy. We know just by virtue of rehab ethos in general, that nobody can be forced to change. Nobody can be forced to become sober. Nobody can be forced to quit smoking cigarettes or any number of other afflictions. That they have to be a willing participant. They have to want to do it for themselves. And forcing children into these programs is something that colors and taints the rest of their experience away from home.
Well, and how old were you at this moment?
I was 16.
You were 16. Okay. So these programs exist only until someone turns 18, I believe, right? Because then you are an adult. You cannot be held there against your will.
I'm sorry, I lost you for a minute. My apologies. What was the question?
I said that these programs exist only until you turn 18. After 18, you are an adult and you cannot be held there against your will.
That's right. You can often sign yourself out of the programs. I knew one client who signed themselves out of the program once they turned 18. I think the idea of the programs is to serve as a barrier between children being sent away to juvenile delinquent centers
Right.
to prevent them from getting into the criminal justice system. But unfortunately, it sort of works the opposite way and shuttles them into the criminal justice system later in life.
Wow. And how expensive are these programs?
A lot of the programs are the equivalent, cost the equivalent of an Ivy League education, somewhere upwards of $35,000, $40,000, $50,000, depending on how long you stay in the programs. A minimum stay at a wilderness therapy center or treatment is 28 days, and it's usually through several $100s a day. It's very expensive, and parents are oftentimes pressed to second mortgage, third mortgage their homes just in order to pay for it. And since it's not evidence-based treatment, insurers are not often willing to cover the fees.
Wow. And are there any success story? I mean, sure, you have highlighted that it's a failure and it doesn't work, but has it ever worked? I mean, they have to put something in the advertisement material in order for parents to believe that this option is viable.
I think a lot of people have been pointing to my own successes as evidence that the programs work, but what they use in their promotional material is success that follows maybe 6 months after someone leaves a program. But unfortunately, that isn't long enough to track someone's trajectory, right? We need to check in 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years to really see how people develop over time. And generally speaking, it comes much later when those problems resurface and carry on into adulthood. This arrested development only shows, through your mid 20s before you can start to recognize some of the signs that the child hasn't really progressed into the well-adjusted adult that they had meant to become.
Okay, so you are taken by force to this place. Can you tell us the day-to-day life into one of these programs?
Well, they're all very different, and a therapeutic component is laced into all the daily activities. So little things end up meaning little things like whether or not you're cleaning your room or whether or not you followed orders correctly and you've done your daily therapeutic tasks, which are generally written assignments, or have met with your therapist, or written a letter to your parents. Those things add up to the ability to have, I don't know, say salt or pepper on your food, or the ability to maybe go home and visit someone of a friend or your family, or maybe have a phone call with your parents, which isn't allowed until you reach a certain criteria within the program. But they all vary differently, and a lot of times they can be broken up by some really heinous acts. If a child is being disruptive or is not willing to go along with the program, as they often say, then in some programs those children are restrained and sedated with drugs in order to more easily comply.
Okay, so you were thrown from one program to the other. What was the failure of the first one and the second one, and how was it that you were in so many different facilities?
Well, I think the major failure was the fact that I was kidnapped in the middle of the night and brought to the first program. I mean, that really disturbed my own ontological security and set me off on a really depressive path. I mean, I was already struggling with anxiety, depression, and then you add on top of this insecurity every time I go to bed is a real failing of the institutions. I had often believed that I would be sent home and could return to my normal life if I just finished the wilderness program. But unfortunately, the education consultant who I mentioned previously then convinced my parents that I needed further therapy and further advancement in my education in therapy, that I was sent to the residential treatment centers and therapeutic boarding schools.
Wow, what what an amazing story. Okay, so eventually you got out of this system. How do you manage to get out? Did you manage to bend your will to what they wanted to do, or you just became an adult?
Yes, absolutely bent my will. It was around maybe my fourth month in the residential or the therapeutic boarding school that I was feeling really uncomfortable and tried to run away from the program, which I wrote about for the New York Times yesterday, and came back to the program and turned myself in, as it were, and was then shipped back to Wilderness. So I did another stint in Wilderness for about 35 days before going to the program in Utah. And by the time I went to Utah, I realized I just needed to do everything that was asked of me, say yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, get all my stuff, all my schoolwork and therapeutic work done in therapy sessions, use all the language that they had required of me, say that I rationalized all my emotions and justified my actions and everything that they wanted to hear me say, I said. So eventually, within 6 months, I think it was, my father and mother decided to pull me out of the program and return me back to New Jersey, where I was living at the time. And I think that was when a lot of things started to go haywire.
Okay, what kind of things went haywire?
Well, the first 6 months were pretty much okay. When I came back, I didn't reconnect with any friends. I wasn't allowed back in my high school. So I started taking classes at the community college nearest my house, my mother's house. I was living with her for a time, and one thing led to another. I'll be vague here because I don't necessarily want to talk too much about it, but I ended up in juvenile detention for a serious crime. And the irony of being in juvenile detention was that was much more comfortable than the programs to which my parents sent me. I found that I was less worried, I was less scared. And you can look at that one of two ways. You can say that juvenile delinquent centers were apt to investigation and more transparency than these programs were. So therefore they had a responsibility to their clients. This isn't always the case, but for me it was. And then the other hand, you could look at it as say that I was already institutionalized and ready for these programs and ready for incarceration, and found some comfort in handcuffs and a cold shower that I found myself right back at home in lockup.
Wow. Okay, so now, I mean, you have a regular job. You seem to be an individual who has adjusted well to society. Um, what created that change? How is it that you transform yourself to a troubled teenager with a lot of difficulty to now a writer, and a very good writer, by the way?
It seems almost miraculous, but around 25, things really changed for me internally, and a lot of things started to click, and I felt this unending ambition to just pursue the love of my life, which was at the time writing. And I really sunk my energies and efforts into writing and journalism and getting published and seeking out stories and pitching and all these things that come with a viable career. But at the same time, I wasn't fully free and clear of these programs. I still to this day really struggle with anxiety and depression. I have an overwhelming sense of worthlessness, and I attribute that to the programs mostly because I was told for so long that I didn't deserve most of this stuff unless I don't know, became completely sober and amended my history of my life in order to eradicate all this bad stuff that happened to me and never do it again. But it taints my day-to-day life, just because I'm never quite comfortable in social situations. I have a terrible time every night when I try to go to sleep. I'm always worried about things that seem very remote and very unlikely in the sense that I could be taken again, or wondering whether or not I've done something wrong that will lead to some other bad situation that is out of my control.
Right. Okay. So in your book, you are critical of these programs. Are you suggesting that they should either be regulated or dismantled altogether, or close, or what is it that you are suggesting at the end?
I've tried very hard in the book to take an even-handed, level, objective approach and try to offer insight into the programs I'm a journalist primarily, and I don't want to be seen as an advocate for one thing or the other, but I can say that there have been efforts to defund and regulate and investigate these programs in the past, and it's never gone well for a myriad reasons. But what I believe could be the most beneficial to ending this sort of treatment of children is well, like I said earlier, that look at the family unit and a more close relationship between parents and their children to avoid any wayward behavior, so that in essence we're sort of restricting these programs from their financial benefits, and we're not patronizing them anymore, and not supporting them through sending our children there.
Well, Kenneth, this is an illuminating story. Can you tell us one more time then the name of your book, and where can people follow you and find out more of what the things that you're up to?
So the book's titled Troubled, The Failed Promise of America's Behavioral Treatment Programs. It published January 12th from Little A, and you can buy it at your local bookstore or Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or if you prefer to support independent booksellers, bookshop.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Kenneth_Rosen or at my website, KennethRrosen.com.
Kenneth, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.